Hello, this is Rachel from the Shades of Orange here with the second part of my April reading wrap-up. I'll be honest, April was actually a really tough month for me. I was very busy at work. I had to do a lot of travel as well. This was also the month when my little hedgehog Kimmy passed away. So the reason I mention all this is it definitely affected my reading. I was a little bit slumpy and didn't read as much as I normally do. However, I still read some and I do want to talk about the good books, so I'm going to talk about everything besides the horror, which is of course included in the first part of my wrap-up. This month was also a bit of a grab bag. A lot of the books I read don't fall neatly into particular genres, so I'm going to try to leave some timestamps down below, but it's really hard to classify these ones. Starting with Regulation 19 by P.T. Hylton, which I received an e-copy from the author. This book follows a man who has been in prison for the last 9 years. And while in prison, he was cut off from communication with the outside world. So when he unexpectedly gets released early and returns to his hometown, he finds that things are quite different. The town is now controlled by a man named Zed, who has invoked a series of rules or regulations in the town, and everyone is diligently following them and punishing anyone who defies these regulations. This story is the kind of story I love. It's about a small town where you're trying to figure out what's going on, what's the secret behind it, and why is it so weird. You know that the town is cut off from the outside world for some reason, but you don't know why. It's really hard to classify this one. It's a bit of science fiction or fantasy. It has elements of horror, even though I don't think it's very scary. And I just found it really immersive, really addictive. In a slumpy month, this is the book that really pulled me back into reading, and I definitely enjoyed it. It has some really good world building as you start to figure out what is happening in the town. I thought all of the ideas were very interesting, and I just really liked where the author went with this. So if you're looking for a really fun, immersive book that is a little bit of a genre-bending, twisty tale, this is a great one to pick up. It's the first part of a trilogy. You could read it as a standalone, but there's definitely a lot of potential for growth from here. So I do look forward to checking out the later books and seeing where the story goes. Then I read a book called The Boys of Summer by Richard Cox. This follows a group of boys that live in a small town that was devastated by a tornado. One of the boys, Todd, was hurt in the tornado and was left in a coma for 4 years. The story takes place over two timelines, one in the 80s when this boy is growing up with his group of friends that call themselves the Boys of Summer. This is the kind of story that blends together different genres. It's a mix of science fiction and maybe horror. Given the synopsis, you can kind of guess that this book gets compared to It by Stephen King a lot. And I like the premise, but honestly, I just wasn't particularly immersed in the story. I thought it was very slow paced and it's very character focused, which I don't mind, but I didn't feel like it had enough narrative drive to really keep me engaged. So this book wasn't really for me, but I'm also not a huge fan of Stephen King's It. So if you are a fan of that book, you might want to check this one out for yourself. You'll likely enjoy it a little more than I did. Now I want to talk about a book called The Forgotten Ones by Steena Holmes. I received a copy of this from the publicist Creative Edge, and this book is about a woman who believes that her grandfather is dead and then finds out that he is actually still alive, but unfortunately is now dying. She is also caring for her mother, who is struggling with her own mental illness. And this is very much a story about a family with a very dark secret. I originally accepted this for review because it was pitched to me as a psychological thriller. However, after reading this, I would more call this a contemporary or a piece of perhaps women's fiction. It's the kind of book that would work really well in a book club. And I think it's very well done. It has good character development, it's well written. And despite not being a genre I normally read, I was actually quite immersed in the story, which I think says a lot. So while this wasn't the type of book I normally pick up, I do think it has a really good audience. And so if you are a fan of contemporaries, I do recommend it. It's a very emotional story. It deals with some really heavy topics like miscarriage and mental illness, topics that I actually personally avoid. But again, I think that a lot of people will get a lot out of this story if you're looking for that emotional, family-driven narrative and are okay with some darker moments in it. This is a really good one to pick up. So while this wasn't the dark and twisted psychological thriller I hoped it would be, I definitely still think a lot of people will enjoy it and do recommend it if it sounds like the kind of narrative that you normally would enjoy. Next, I read a thriller called Good Behavior by Blake Crouch. This is the same author who wrote Dark Matter and Pines, which I both really enjoyed. This is a set of 3 novellas that follow a woman named Letty who is a thief Each of the story involves her getting into a situation and trying to get herself out of it. The first story follows her when she is breaking into hotel rooms and stealing from the guests, and she ends up overhearing a conversation about a man hiring a hitman to murder his wife. Normally a person would take that information and go to the police, but because she was in the hotel room to steal, she doesn't feel like she can go to the authorities and instead tries to take matters into her own hand. This is a book that is very much character driven and at the same time has a lot of action, so it's really the best of both worlds. I enjoyed it a lot. Letty is such a memorable character and is so morally gray, which is something I like. I do think she's very likable. Despite the fact that she's a thief, she does have her own moral code and really tries to do the right thing as best as she sees it. Each story has a little bit of a twist or turn, and I definitely enjoyed all three of the stories and would definitely recommend it. I'd love to read more if he writes more in the Letty series, and I know there's a TV show, so I might check out that as well, but definitely recommend that one to anyone who enjoys a thriller with a really likable, tough female main character. So that's it for this reading wrap up. As always, love to know if you're planning on picking up any of the books I mentioned. Otherwise, hopefully life is good and you're taking care of yourself, especially when life is stressful. I know it's so important to be good to yourself. And I will of course talk to you later in another video. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye.